like to start and introduce our two panelists today. So the first, Kamelia Lechani. She graduated from BSU in 2012 with an MBA. And then Victor Rodriguez graduated from BSU with a master's in accounting in 2016. And he was also a former graduate assistant for ISSS. So if Kamelia and Victor, if you would like to introduce yourselves and explain a little more.
Yeah. So I came to BSU. I'm originally from Venezuela. That's where I was born. Kind of traveled all over the place. I came to BSU. I was living in Spain, and then I transferred. Started my master's. So I'm kind of like Venezuela via Spain. And I graduated in 2016 with a master's in accounting.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kamelia. I'm from Morocco, and I've been an international student since I was 16 years old. I currently work at ESD Global. Which stands for Empowerment and Self-Defense, and it's about creating a safe space for women and vulnerable individuals. It's an NGO based in the US. And I graduated with an MBA with an additional certificate in finance as well.
So first question, would you both please tell us a little bit more about yourself, your current job? Feel free to mention any other jobs you've had while on OPT, but you may no longer be working.
Unfortunately, I'm currently unemployed. I was working at PricewaterhouseCoopers, aka PwC. It's an accounting firm, for 3.5 years. I was laid off kind of like at the very beginning of this pandemic. And yeah, that's the only job that I've had since I graduated from Bridgewater.
Prior to the job that I mentioned earlier, I actually was working as a social media and digital marketing coordinator for a music nonprofit organization. And again, because of the pandemic, it had to be terminated, but I was lucky enough to find the job that I was talking to you about, the ESD Global one, since November.
Would you both please describe your experience with the OPT application process? How did you feel? Were you nervous, anxious?
All of the above. From my case, I had the opportunity to apply for OPT after my bachelor degree, because I also pursued my bachelor's in the US. But to say the least, I think it's important for your advisor to be prepared and to be updated with current policies. And so my first experience with OPT was not really great, because my advisor didn't know much about the policies or about the specifics, but Justin knew. So for me, it went a lot smoother and a lot better, even though it took longer to get the card, but the process was a lot better compared to my first one.
Yeah, I would echo what Kamelia said. Definitely doing the OPT process through Bridgewater was very, it was top notch compared to my previous, like my undergrad administrator. Same thing. There was a lot of like just missing gaps in the knowledge, and they weren't up to speed with the most current, regulations in place. I felt very comfortable doing it with Justin and the ISSS office in general, especially because we have the workshop, and you get to ask questions that relate to specifically to your particular scenario, because not every international student is going to be the same, or they're doing the same degree. Surely things have changed since then, but the fact that you get to do it 2 months or 2.5 months before you finish graduating is huge, because you kind of, you're prepared, and it gives you enough of a time period where you can receive your documentation before you begin working, because you can't.
Victor, you went muted.
Sorry, can you hear me now? Okay. No, I was just saying, like, you can't begin, you know, it's good to do it in a timely fashion because you can't begin working at whatever company may hire you until you actually have that EAD in your hand, like physically. At least that was the case for me.
Did I pay either of you to say anything nice about me?
No.
Yes,
No.
yes, you did.
Violation of OPT regulations if you did.
No, if I didn't really appreciate Jen and Justin's work, I wouldn't even be part of these Zoom meetings. So just so you know, yeah.
We appreciate you both. So next question. I guess, what is one thing you wish you knew before you applied for OPT? And this can go back to your previous experiences, not just before you applied at BSU.
Yeah. So, I mean, I wish that I knew they'd be cutting it close. So USCIS sent everything through the Postal Service. And even back, you know, in 2016, there were still delays regarding the process. So like I got my EAD literally like 3 days before I was officially set to start working at PwC. So like I was a neurotic mess. So I wish that, you know, I wish I knew that the timelines were, you know, kind of far out and not as instant as you would like it to be. You know, you're the person who's applying for this and like providing all the documentation and, you know, dotting your I's, crossing your T's, but ultimately, like you also, it depends on like the luck. There's a bit of luck involved too.
I would say not to worry as much. I think you're just going to be hurting yourself. But if you're going to be well prepared and you did everything you can, and your advisor is also well informed, there's nothing else you can do. So just don't worry as much as you should.
So while at BSU, oh, sorry, no, different question. When you were like getting ready to look for a job, what resources did you utilize? Any specific websites, professional networks? Like, how did you look for your job?
Well, for me, first thing I did was to go to the career services to see what kind of resources I could use. In my opinion, I don't think they're very helpful, especially towards international students, because your options are quite different for compared to an American citizen. So you can go to the career service, see what they can offer you, but do not rely on them. Do your own research. I think LinkedIn is a great source, not only just to find opportunities, but also to network. That's actually how I was able to find the job that I have right now. So go far and beyond when it comes to doing your research. Do not rely on career services, because most of the jobs that they provide in the career fair, you would find maybe 2 or 3 that may be sponsoring students. So do not rely on them entirely.
Yeah, I would say, you know, I used all the things that Kamelia has mentioned. You know, LinkedIn is huge, especially nowadays. I feel like if you're not on LinkedIn, you don't stand a chance, I feel like, in the hiring process, because that's the first thing that recruiters are looking for, so that they can kind of vet you. I would also say, like, you know, reach out to your professors. That's how I managed to get in touch with a person who recruited at PwC. Was a former professor of mine once worked in the Big Four, and one of her students became a hiring manager at one of these firms. And so she actually, you know, put me in touch, gave me her email and told me, hey, reach out, like speak to this person. And then Bridgewater, like the different departments, so like in the accounting department they had a recruiting event where, like, you know, a select few of us got to go, or we could volunteer to go to the actual, like, there was like a panel that they had going on at the office in the Boston office. And I actually met the recruiter in person, shook her hand, introduced myself. And I think that goes a long way, because it's like, hey, like, put the face to the email, you know. That was a bit, I think that kind of set everything else in motion when it came to, you know, like, networking is huge. I can't like understate that. It's, I would say, the most crucial part of it. And also attending the work fairs, if those even are a thing right now with the pandemic, attending the work fairs, talking to recruiters that are there, that's also very important. But I do agree that it's a little more difficult when you're an international student because of all the regulations surrounding, you know, hiring international students. It's a little more tedious, and there's not as many opportunities.
So just want to talk a little bit more about BSU Career Services. Could you discuss like what specific resources you utilized with them? I know, Kamelia, you said that you had not the best experience, but what specific resources did you go to them for? Was it like your resume, cover letter help, interview skills? I think you mentioned the like career fair, but if you could just elaborate more on what you went to career services for.
Absolutely. I went to resume, cover letter, interview, mock-up training, and all the career fairs, even the ones that might not be related to my major. I also, and career services is like divided in two. There's a part for after graduation, and there's a part for internships. So I went to both sides. They actually, right now, they used to be in different floors, but I believe now they're on the same floor. Your question was about what? The second question?
So just what services did you go to them for? And then you kind of already answered it about your experience, but kind of more, if you want to elaborate on why you didn't have a great experience, what you hoped you could have got more out of it, what you didn't get out of it, I guess.
Okay. I think for the resume, it started pretty well because when they had an opportunity where you would meet with an actual hiring person from a different company that would come and check your resume. So at first it was a great experience when it comes to getting to know what they think about my resume, what I need to change, what I need to rectify or get more catchy about it. But later on, when it comes to actual opportunities, applying for jobs and getting answers, I was in touch with a career counselor, and at first she kind of was very passionate about guiding me and mentoring me. But I think when we were trying and getting in touch with different types of people from different companies, that they didn't have really a great connection from what I understood. I thought I would have done a better job on my own, just getting in touch with college recruiters, attending webinars on LinkedIn where you will be able to directly ask questions to these people who work in those companies that hire international students as well. And when it comes to career fair, in my opinion, I don't think it was as diverse as it should have been. There were, as I said, there were 2 or 3 people that said they could sponsor H-1B visa. Most of them were accounting and computer science related companies. But when it comes to other majors, it was not as much. Some of them don't even want to hire OPT students because they know that you can only work for them for a year and then later on they're not able to sponsor you. So why would they invest in that whole year in you? There are other companies that do that, but they were not in that career fair. And that's why I was a little bit disappointed in that. That's why you should rely on yourself when it comes to networking and getting to know information about the hiring process for majors, especially other than computer science and finance.
Yeah, that was excellent. I went to career services to have help with my resume. They definitely, you know, I think they deal enough with the recruiters and like hiring managers that they have a nice pulse on like what they're specifically looking for in terms of resume. I feel like cover letters have gone out of style from what I've experienced over the last few years. It's now more like resume and like tailor it specific to, you know, the job that you're going for. But yeah, they did a really nice job regarding that. But I would say that, you know, it is a little, it's definitely more difficult when you're an international student. I think you should start, if you have an opportunity, like if you're a sophomore, I think you start laying the groundwork when you're a sophomore. Do not wait until you're on your final semester of your senior year to start looking for jobs, because that, if you're planning on working here in the United States, that'll add a lot of extra pressure. Not only do you have to continue, getting good grades or aiming to get good grades, you're also going to have all that extra pressure on yourself of, oh boy, I need to find a job right now, otherwise I can't work, once my semester's over.
Thinking more about your time at BSU, are there any other resources, workshops, like organizations, like clubs or organizations within your academic department or graduate studies? So resources, workshops, programs, organizations, events that helped you prepare for OPT and working in the United States?
I feel like even though, I went through the entire accounting, like master's in accounting, nothing really prepared me for, for the actual job that I was going to be doing. You can learn as much as you can via a textbook, but it's going to be completely different when you actually start applying that knowledge and those skill sets and transferring over to the real world. Even silly as like a terminology that you learn in a book, people look at you weird when you use it in like, in the professional environment, because it's like, that's not what they, the semantics are a little different. I reached out to all my professors who I had a good relationship with. They can tell, if you're involved and you're actively participating and you're like, they can tell who's actually like hungry to be looking for jobs and putting themselves out there. And I really, really recommend that you do that. I know it's hard to, you probably get shy because it's like, you maybe don't speak English that well, but you have to make the effort, because that's only going to continue. You're going to get way more exposure when you start working to other people, and you're going to have to learn to work with so many different kinds of people and like be able to speak to a group or, to management or whoever when you're actually in the real world. I had to do that a lot when I, working with client contacts. You would literally have to walk into their office and like introduce yourself and try to establish rapport with them. So really put yourself out there. That's one of my biggest pieces of advice that I can give as it relates to working in the United States.
I have nothing to add.
Could you both talk a little bit more about like the interview hiring process? What was it like? Like how many jobs, if you're comfortable sharing, did you apply to? Just the overall applying to jobs. So like, let's say you've already done the OPT application with USCIS, and now it's on to looking for the actual job. So just talk about that process.
Well, for me, I started looking for jobs right before the pandemic started. So you can imagine how the impact of it has been. Applying for a job is an actual job, because you're going to be applying a lot. And if you want your application to be great, it has to be adaptable to every position. So that means there's a lot of work for each and every application you do. And I think when it comes to interviews, I think getting an email that you got an interview is a big win. It's like a first great step, but it does not mean that it's over. So always be prepared. I had, for my interview, for my current job, I had 2 rounds of interview. The first one was with the with the manager / supervisor, and the second one was with the president of the organization. So it was intense, but I had to be prepared. I had to be well informed about the organization. But before that, there were not as many interviews as I would have wanted compared to when I graduated with my bachelor's, because job offers were not the same as in normal times. So I applied a lot. I actually cannot tell you how many I did, but every day I would wake up from morning to, I mean, the whole day. I was stuck on my computer for pretty much the whole pandemic. So I don't mean to be negative, but it was rough. But it's worth it. Just don't give up. Yeah.
Yeah, so when I started looking, I wasn't, when I started working, it wasn't during pandemic time, so I can't really speak to that, but I did the same thing. I would, get my coursework done, and I targeted companies that I knew, accounting firms that I knew had the capacity to hire me on an like as OPT first, but with a potential to also sponsor me for an H-1B visa. So that really filtered out like a lot of the smaller, type companies who just don't have the resources to do so. And so then I just specifically focused on that. And for me, it was also like a goal of mine. Like I wasn't going to accept anything other than working at a big four. So like that's where I focused on, and like attending the recruiting events and meeting people who actually work there. My experience during the hiring process, I mean, it's like a threefold type thing where you get in touch with the recruiters. Those recruiters, if once you pass their filters, they end up reaching out via email. They'll send you, they'll schedule a time for a phone interview. That's how my whole journey started, was with a phone interview, where they kind of gauge. It's more like they try to assess your personality. They ask you a lot of like behavioral based questions. It's not so much like your true skill set. And I think that's, they're looking, at least in my experience for accounting, for public accounting, they're looking for people who they can kind of get a feel for, that who can work well with teams. That's huge in that industry. And then after that, I found out, they sent me an email to then formalize, okay, here's the date when we'd like you to come in to interview. I went through 3 different people that I interviewed with. I interviewed with, a regular like senior associate who does the everyday work. Then I interviewed with a senior manager, and ultimately interviewed with a partner at the firm. And ultimately, like, they're the ones who make the decision whether they're gonna hire you or not. And as I was in the Uber driving like on the way back to my car, I got the call from the partner and like letting me know, hey, we'd like to extend you an offer. It was super exciting. And yeah, so that was my experience. I don't know how it's changed. I know that when I was last working there, they were all moving towards digital interviews only. So they do interviews over Zoom now. There's not as much like, the old school in-person type interviews. It's more, you actually have a Zoom meeting like this with a partner of the firm or a senior manager, which like, that's kind of tough. I wish everybody the best if they have to do that, because like, I don't know how I'd be able to do it, starting to look for a job and then just having to do it via remote like this would be really something else. But yeah, that was my experience.
Victor, I do have a follow-up question for you. Could you elaborate and explain what the Big Four is?
Oh yeah. So the Big Four are known, you've probably heard of them, or you've probably seen it on, like, if you watch golf, like Phil Mickelson, KPMG. They're the largest accounting and consulting firms in the world. They pretty much audit all of the Fortune 500 companies. Even the top 2,000 companies in the country are mostly audited by the Big Four. They're just, they're multinational, like, partner firms. So, they're everywhere: Spain, Russia, China, wherever. And so they have like, I would say they have over 180,000 employees, each firm worldwide. So, they're massive compared to, like a local accounting firm. who only does like, mom and pop shops and smaller type clients.
Thank you. So for both of you, what has it been like working in the US? Obviously, the pandemic has changed things, but overall, what's your experience been like working with Americans? Any pros and cons you'd like to discuss compared to, say, working in your home country? Yeah, please feel free.
It's gonna be hard for me to like compare it because I've never worked in my home country, but I know that there's a lot more freedom in, at least for me, in speaking my opinion and talking about things that could perhaps bother me when it comes to certain people or certain work-related items. I'm part of an organization that is all about diversity and inclusion, which is for me extremely, extremely important. So just the fact that I work under that umbrella, it means that I can be myself. I don't have to pretend to be a certain person or behave a certain way when it comes to work. Overall, I like it. It's diverse in terms of ideas and opinions. And one thing that I'm certain, even though I didn't work back in my home country, there's always room for creativity and thinking outside of the box. You have high-level people always willing to get new ideas or want to know if you want to add something to the table or anything like that. And I think that's pretty great and pretty important as well.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I would say from, working in the United States, productivity is the king. Their productivity rules the show, kind of say. I worked with a lot of, speaking of diversity, I worked with a lot of people from different nationalities, from China. I worked with, it was very diverse, but I also kind of noticed, like, more at the top level of the ranks, it was not as diverse as I would have liked it. And a lot of people that I worked with also it was a kind of a running joke where it's like, yeah, it's like diversity for us, but not diversity at the top. I did get to work with a lot of women from all different backgrounds, which to me was a very, it was an eye-opening experience, because going into these, these are like the big four accounting firms. They're very conservative, very old school, predominantly male, white male dominant, like they're the guys who run the show. But, I was very pleasantly surprised when it didn't turn, like my experience didn't turn out to be the case. I had a lot of mentors. All my seniors, my managers, senior managers were all women. And ultimately, I would say that if you do have room to speak your mind and to bring ideas to the table, but it's also a matter of having somebody who's a mentor to you. That really makes all the difference on, whether you continue to be there at the company long term or you kind of get pushed out. It's very political. You have to play nice. You have to, haha, you got to laugh even though something's not funny. At least that was my experience. The people who, kind of like pack up their bags and go home at the end of the day and don't do anything, those people tended to not last as long at my firm. So it's like, they not only do they want, obviously you're spending hours upon hours with them at work, but there's an expectation that you're also going to socialize and kind of integrate yourself with the company, with the firm, and like kind of embody those firm values that they have. So, yeah.
Great. You guys talked about a lot of challenges already, but are there any other challenges that you experienced throughout the entire process? So from being a student, applying to OPT, applying for jobs, looking for jobs, working in general, any challenges that you haven't discussed that you're comfortable sharing?
Sure. Yeah. So just the challenge of like once I was in the process of being sponsored for an H-1B visa, unfortunately, it just so happened to be during Donald Trump's first year as president. And it threw a lot of things kind of like into a tailspin. Processes got delayed, timelines got pushed out. A lot more rejections started happening where previously in other administrations there weren't as many rejections for the same kind of role and level and experience. There also, like, I would say 2 years into the whole thing, like the compliance matters got even more strict. And so whereas before I used to not have to report like which client site I would be working at, it became a lot more strict. Like I had to go through multiple H-1B amendments, which the law team reaches out for you to kind of like, oh, you're going to be working at somewhere that's not your home office. Okay, well, we need to file an H-1B amendment in order to reflect that. And it's like a whole process. There's a whole questionnaire. Like, you know, there's all these new regulations that they have to abide by. And I think ultimately that's what ended up kind of being like the breaking point in terms of keeping me on as an H-1B versus letting me go. I think costs of compliance just got way too high and like out of hand, and they just didn't want to incur those costs anymore. So that was a big challenge for me.
I think for me was applying for jobs during the pandemic. Because last time when I did my OPT, I started work exactly when my OPT started, but this time I started, I think, a month or two, I can't remember, but it was later. So way later. So it's a bit stressful because you're only allowed to throw of 3 months unemployment. So you have the stress of finding a job, but you also have the stress of being obliged to leave the US. And I think it was really challenging to stay sane during this crazy time and to apply for jobs while being constrained with all types of limitation. But I mean, just do your best so that you don't have to blame yourself after there's a negative result if it happens, but just keep pushing. It should be fine.
Yeah, I think you both went through two uniquely different stressful times for different reasons. And I think for anyone who's graduating this semester, still being in the midst of the pandemic, if you're thinking about applying for OPT, this is still an equally challenging time. But as both Victor and Kamelia have proved, even if things are challenging, you can still achieve great things. So just a couple more questions. And so this one is kind of, if we can elaborate a little bit more on the H-1B. So what I'll do is I'm going to explain that right now. And then if you both have any experience with the H-1B, if you want to elaborate more, say Victor, than what you already said. But for those of you who may not be familiar, the H-1B is a different status/visa category. So if you're here in the United States on an F1 status, you're eligible for OPT, which is this whole conversation after graduation. And through OPT, you can remain while you're in the United States. If your employer is willing to sponsor you and able to sponsor you, they could file a change of status request on your behalf. So you can change your status to H-1B, which would mean you'd be locked into that company for the duration of the H-1B, and you would continue working for them if USCIS approves the change of status. So if you all have applied for the H-1B, what was that process like? Victor, I know you kind of mentioned the challenge of the Trump presidency and that's effect, but if you could just elaborate overall about what was it like approaching the company, maybe talking to them about your interest in pursuing the H-1B, and then maybe working with their lawyer and how that whole process went.
Yeah, so in my case, they know right from they know before they even extend you the job offer, whether you're seeking, because as part of the application process, you check off the box that you're an international student that ultimately will be seeking sponsorship. So they knew right from before they even extended the offer that I was not your traditional, employee. And then once I started working there, it all kind of happened in the background. Like these firms, these big four firms, they have so many resources and so many, the lawyer arm of the firm, like they kind of did the whole process for me. Everything's in-house. So they basically, like, I got an email all of a sudden, like with a checklist of items that I needed to provide to them by a certain date so that they can have everything, lined up so that they can, because they file the H-1B thing on your behalf. You as the employee cannot do that yourself. It's all based on the employer. So, I got sent a checklist of items, photocopies of all sorts of documents, OPTs. Make sure that you're scanning every single OPT or I-20 or J-1 piece of paper that you've had to change. Make sure you have that digital just in case. Make sure you have the back pages of where it's been signed or whether your OPT was approved. Make sure you keep very good records of that, because you will be requested to provide that when you are going through this process. Photocopies of your degrees. Make sure that you get your transcripts, your college transcripts, pay the $10 or whatever and keep a copy to yourself so that you can have it, because you will be asked for all of that and more. Passport photos, all sorts of identification documents, visas that you've had in the past, all of that. It was like kind of like going through my entire, my previous 5 years in the US to get to that point. Like they wanted everything.
Yeah, that's pretty much sums it all. But there are some companies that do not ask you always if you're going to require H-1B visa sponsorship. They usually ask, are you legally allowed to work in the US? So that means you can have a green card or other types of visas. Sometimes I would suggest that, although it could be very uncomfortable, is to have a conversation with the manager or anyone in the upper level about this, because sometimes you would be surprised, not sometimes, I would say maybe 50% of the time, a lot of people do not know about H-1B visa sponsorship. But it does not mean that they're not allowed to apply it for you, because they can hire a lawyer for that. You also have to know that for private companies, they have limited amount of people they can give the H-1B visa, but for research-based or nonprofit organization, it's capped exempt, meaning that they can have kind of as much people as they can. For me, I'm still in the process of figuring that out, but it was very important to me to keep that position regardless of where I'll be staying, either inside or outside of the US, because my focus right now is more of having a long-term career trail. So I'm having a discussion about it, but I'm not sure if it's going to happen or not. But it's good to have this discussion before, because usually I think you're allowed to apply in March, I believe, beginning of March. So have that discussion with your supervisor or manager before January, if possible.
Yeah, the annual deadline for the H-1B is April 1st.
Yeah.
Materials need to be submitted into USCIS. But if your employer is working with a lawyer, the lawyer should be the one keeping track of those deadlines and making sure that all the paperwork is in on time. I did want to just elaborate a little bit more on record retention. So as Victor had mentioned, it is very important for you all to maintain your records, hold on to your I-20s. Even if you attended previous schools, keep copies of your documents. If you attended previous schools and you don't have them, now might be a good time to reach out to those schools and ask if they can provide you photocopies just so you'll have them on file. So just to let you know, at Bridgewater, we are legally required and we keep to it. But with that, we do have a cutoff because we can't keep your records forever. but we keep your records for 5 years after you have completed your program with us. So if you graduate and you change your status or you go to your home country, we'll keep your records for 5 years from when you graduated. If you graduate and you do OPT, then we will keep your records for 5 years after your OPT expired, okay? So if you 5 years from now, you need a copy of an old I-20 because maybe you're doing the H-1B or something like that, or maybe you're going for your green card, email us and we'll go into the basement, pull out your file, dust it off and make a photocopy and email it to you. I actually just had a student yesterday email me for copies of I-20s, and so I was able to provide them to her. So keep in touch with us even after you graduated, but importantly, keep your current records up to date. With that, just one final, if you have any final advice you'd like to share, then I'm going to move into the pre-submitted questions, and then we'll get to any questions that folks who are with us right now have. So any final advice you'd like to share?
This all may sound really daunting. It won't be when you're doing it. I think just like, I know that it sounds scary, but I would say just keep your head down, like work hard, keep a positive mindset, so that your nerves don't get to you. Sometimes our biggest enemies are we're our biggest enemies. So just really try to keep a positive attitude and mindset toward this, because it will help you, battle those storms, if you will.
If you can get a mentor, it would be really great, especially someone who maybe has been through the same you've been, or who is an American but was an international student. I think it could be really helpful. I had a mentor during the pandemic, and it was life-changing for me. So if you could just try attend webinars on LinkedIn, expand your network. It's pretty easy to get a mentor in the US arena.
Great, thank you both. So these next two questions were pre-submitted through the poll that Kristen had sent out. I will ask them, and then I will respond to them from an ISSS perspective, just because I think they were geared a little bit more towards the OPT application process. But by all means, once I answer the question, if you both wouldn't mind chiming in and maybe providing your own experience. So the first one was, how long did it take for USCIS to send you your EAD? And then how long did it take for you to know if you were approved or not? So the way it works is when you apply for OPT, you submit your application, and I'll assist you with this. And again, you all got the email about the OPT workshops, and I'll provide you more details on this next week. So sign up and attend an OPT workshop. But basically you apply to USCIS, and the average time historically from the date you submit your application to USCIS has been 3 to 4 months. Now, there were times when it took 5 months in recent, the last year or so. And then there were times where it took 1 month. So it's really hard to say exactly how long it will take you, but USCIS on their website does have processing times that you can look up. Sometimes they're accurate, sometimes they're not, but we say on average it takes 3 to 4 months for the card to be received. If you're fortunate enough, you may get it earlier. If they're experiencing a heavy course load, or if they're going through some kind of like a year or so ago under the Trump administration, if they were going through some changes within Homeland Security and SEVP, then it may take a little bit longer for processing. It's just really hard to predict. So I don't know if you both would like to share your experience and how long it took to get your card and get your approval.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned, because when we did it back in late 2016, I did it right before Thanksgiving break, and I just received the EAD right like December 29th, like 3 days before I was set to start. So like in my situation back during those times, like it seems like things were moving a lot like faster. I can't speak to what it is now, but just based on my experience after this, after going through H-1B, like a lot of things have taken months instead of just maybe 1 or 2. So I would just mentalize in my head, like, okay, this is going to take 5 to 6 months instead of whatever they may say, just so that so you can kind of feel better about yourself. If it comes in earlier, great. But that way you're not like getting nervous about how long it's taking.
For me, for my first one, after my bachelor's, I applied, it was in 2017. I applied, I remember in April and I got it in March. It was a month span, but I believe because I was in the South, that's what I thought. However, in here, it took me 5 months to get it. And I applied, I believe by the end of February. I applied really early and I requested it for the latest possible, which was like the second week of July. And I got it. It was pretty stressful to wait for it, but yeah, I mean, considering what was happening around the world, 5 months I thought was quite normal.
So the second question is, can you travel to your home country while on OPT? And then there's other parts to this question that I'll elaborate on. Do we actually when do we need to start the paperwork? And then what if you get accepted to another degree program, say a PhD, before your OPT ends? So the first piece of this I want to explain is, yes, you can travel, although this semester I don't recommend it if you're going to graduate in May, just because of the pandemic. There's a whole host of other concerns and reasons we wouldn't recommend traveling, but you are completely entitled to. Just know that the U.S. may enact travel bans for health and safety if you travel to a high-risk place or country during that time. You may be denied entry not on grounds of your OPT or your F1 status, but you may be denied entry because of the pandemic. So if you're a sophomore and you're not going to graduate, say, for 2 more years, then you got plenty of time. Hopefully the whole world goes back to normal. And if everything stays the way it is as far as regulations, then absolutely you can travel. When do you need to start the paperwork? So again, I'll elaborate this a little more, but the earliest you could apply is 90 days before graduation. So whenever you're set to graduate, the earliest application you could set into USCIS would be 90 days or 3 months before your graduation date. Again, I'll elaborate more on that during the workshop, so please attend an OPT workshop and I'll explain that more in depth. And then if you get accepted to another program while you're on OPT, what happens is if you're still doing your OPT and you still have time, you have 1 or 2 things. You either start the program and forfeit the remaining OPT time, or you, if you're able to defer the program and begin your OPT, begin the program within 5 months of finishing your OPT, then you could just defer the program and start it within 5 months of the expiration of the OPT. So it's a little bit more complicated, something that you and I will need to discuss individually, your case-by-case basis. But I don't know, Victor, Kamelia, if you have had any experience traveling while on OPT or changing programs while on OPT?
I didn't change programs, but as I mentioned earlier, I got my OPT in 2017, which means it was the start of the Trump administration. So I think it was not a good idea to travel or risk it, because even people with green cards couldn't get in once they left the country. So I know it's hard because you're going to miss your family for those who don't have their family around them. I was lucky to have my mom come visit me, but to be honest with you, I wouldn't risk it at all, especially during these uncertain times. Policies are changing every 2 weeks, especially between Europe and US, because most of the time you're going to transit in Europe. So I honestly, if I were you, I wouldn't travel at all.
Yeah, I would say, yeah, travel within the U.S. Don't leave the U.S. and stay within the 48 states, like the continental U.S. Don't try to travel to Hawaii. Don't try to travel to Alaska, because that's just going to invite a whole host of other immigration related issues, especially when you're doing, like transit through Canada or something. Not that I've done it, but I've just, speaking with my lawyer who's been helping me with my process currently, it's just been like you want to avoid any of those kind of pitfalls. When I was on H-1B, when I did go visit my family back in Madrid, I did have to apply for my actual H-1B visa stamp, even though my H-1B was valid. You're not allowed to come back into the United States until you actually have a valid visa stamp in your passport. Just seems really silly, but that's just how it works. Because your visa, your H-1B is valid, but if you don't have that sticker in your passport, then you can't get let back into the country. And also, depending on where you're from, you may have like a visa, like when they stamp it on your thing, it says duration of stay, or visas also have multiple entries. Some visas are one entry only. So that's really only going to depend on where you're from, like what your country of origin is from. So keep that in mind. I'm only speaking from my experience. Other people will have very different experiences, especially some of my coworkers from China had very different experiences where they had like a one-time entry visa versus multiple entry.
Great, thank you both. So I did get one more question sent to me by William, asking, so as long as we are hired to work for a company, would you say that we would be all set for our OPT? So I don't think this is something you all need to respond to. I'll respond to it, but I wanted to say it so everyone could hear. But basically the way it works is you can start looking for a job at any point while in your final semester. You don't need a job to apply for OPT, but you do need OPT to start the job. So what will happen is you can start applying to jobs, you can start interviewing, but you'll have to disclose that I can't start working till my OPT is approved by USCIS, and I receive the card in the mail with the start date. So what will happen is you may commit to a job, and the job, so I'll add, the job has to be related to your major. And again, these are all details I'll explain at the OPT workshops. So once you get hired, you're offered a position, you have to wait for that card to come in the mail with the OPT approval. Once you get that card, whatever the start date is, that's when you can start working for the employer, okay? And then again, I'll discuss this at the workshops, but there are certain criteria that you will need to report either to myself or Jen, or you will need to report to SEVP through the OPT portal, which is something you'll get emailed on your start date. That's on your EAD card. So basically start looking for jobs, but you can't actually do the job till you get approval for OPT. And as I said, it could take 3 to 4 months to get that approval. So there's a lot of planning and there's a lot of steps you have to do. So with that, does anyone have any final questions they'd like to ask? Feel free to unmute if you do have a question.
I have a quick question about OPT and CPT. So I was trying to apply for internships, but I'm not sure if I'm supposed to use, I think you're supposed to be approved for CPT, right?
Yes.
So I'm not sure if I'm approved for CPT or I have to use my OPT to apply for the internship.
No, so yes, let me elaborate on that. So if you are interested in CPT, which would be an internship while you're a student, please email me separately, and then we'll have a conversation based on your eligibility within your program. Because CPT is specific to your program, you need to, it needs to be a requirement of the program. Where OPT is after graduation, it's optional employment or optional practical training. So it's not required of the program, if that makes sense. So CPT would be while you're a student, if the internship, clinical, practical experience is required by the program. OPT is after graduation. So CPT approval comes directly from ISSS, so myself and Jen. OPT approval comes from USCIS, and I will help you with that process. But they are two different things. So why don't you send me a separate email and then we can touch base on it.
I think
All right,
Sarah
thank
had
you.
a question too.
Oh, Sarah, it sounds like we can't hear you very well, even though you're muted. Okay, you're going to type. Great, thank you. Darn it.
Technology is great until it's not.
That's right.
Tell me about it.
I feel like Justin looks like he's like in the tropics with sun coming in. Where is the sun? We're in this like 2 towns over. I have no sun.
Send
Yeah,
some
yeah.
my way too, please.
East Bridgewater just is so much better than regular Bridgewater. I don't know what to tell you.
While we're waiting for Sarah's question in the chat, does anybody else? Oh, here we go. Go ahead, Justin.
So Sarah, I think you asked if I'm on an OPT and I have a valid F1 visa in my passport, can I leave the country, come back without having to go to the consulate? So yes, if you have that valid visa and a valid I-20 and a valid travel signature, there are certain criteria that I would recommend for travel. We can go ahead and you can travel. But what I'll do is attend an OPT workshop and I'll explain the different criteria. So if you're pending OPT, like you haven't received the card, there's certain things that I would recommend you travel with. But if you have received the card, then there's other things that I would recommend you travel with. And I'll elaborate more on that at the workshop. But yes, if your visa is valid, then you don't need a new F1 visa. But if your visa has expired, then you do need to get a new F1 visa. So you would have to go to the consulate or embassy in your home country. Okay, any other questions? Okay, I think we are at time. So I'd like to